You're standing in the grand hall of a medieval castle, watching what appears to be a lavish wedding feast. Golden goblets gleam in the torchlight, elaborate tapestries hang from stone walls, and the air fills with the sound of lutes and laughter. But something feels wrong. The bride sits motionless at the high table, her wedding gown hanging loose on her gaunt frame. Her eyes are sunken, her cheekbones sharp as knife blades. When servants place food before her, she doesn't eat. She can't eat. Because this isn't a celebration of love, it's the culmination of the most twisted marriage test in history. For months, this young woman has been systematically starved, her body pushed to the very edge of death, all to prove her worthiness to become queen. The king who orchestrated this horror sits beside her, smiling with satisfaction as his bride struggles to remain conscious. What you're witnessing isn't medieval romance. It's one of the most calculated acts of cruelty ever inflicted in the name of royal matrimony. Before diving into this forgotten story of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The year is 1453, and Europe trembles under the weight of constant warfare, plague, and political upheaval. Constantinople has fallen to the Ottomans, ending 1,000 years of Byzantine rule. The printing press has just been invented, spreading ideas faster than ever before. But in the remote mountain kingdom of Moldavia, nestled between the expanding Ottoman Empire and the ambitious kingdom of Hungary, time seems frozen in an earlier, darker age. This is where our story begins, in the court of Vlad the Impaler. Yes, that Vlad, the inspiration for Dracula. But the monster in this tale isn't the infamous Wallachian prince. It's his lesser-known cousin, Stefan the Mad, who ruled the neighboring principality with a cruelty that made even Vlad seem reasonable by comparison. Stefan had earned his epithet not through battlefield prowess or political cunning, but through a series of increasingly bizarre and brutal experiments in human suffering that he called tests of worthiness. Stefan's obsession with testing people's limits began in childhood. Palace records describe a boy who tortured small animals not out of simple cruelty, but with a scientist's methodical precision. He would deprive mice of food for specific periods, documenting how long they survived, how their behavior changed when they turned on each other. His tutors, terrified of the prince's father, pretended these experiments showed intellectual curiosity rather than recognizing them as early signs of a profoundly disturbed mind. As Stefan grew into adolescence, his experiments expanded to include the castle's servants. He would test their loyalty by withholding wages, their courage by forcing them into dangerous situations, their endurance by making them work without rest for days at a time. Those who failed his tests simply disappeared, their families told they had been reassigned to distant posts. Those who passed found themselves elevated to positions of trust, creating a court culture where survival depended entirely on the prince's whims. When Stefan inherited the throne in 1448 at the age of 22, his subjects hoped that the responsibilities of rule would moderate his excesses. Instead, they provided him with an entire kingdom to use as his laboratory. His first royal decree established what he called the Trials of Truth, elaborate tests designed to reveal the character of his nobles, merchants, and clergy. These weren't simply cruel punishments for wrongdoing. They were systematic experiments in human degradation disguised as moral examinations. A merchant accused of cheating customers might be forced to survive on the exact amount of food he had allegedly stolen from others. A noble suspected of cowardice would be locked in a tower with a pack of hungry wolves, armed only with a dull knife. A priest who preached about the virtue of poverty would have all his possessions confiscated and be forced to beg for survival while Stefan watched from his palace windows. But Stefan's most elaborate and horrifying test was reserved for the women who sought to become his queen. The king had remained unmarried well into his 20s, not from lack of opportunity, but because he claimed no woman had yet proven herself worthy of sharing his throne. What he really meant was that no woman had yet satisfied his twisted need to see human beings pushed beyond all reasonable limits of endurance. Stefan's requirements for a bride were unlike anything in European royal tradition. Beauty mattered, but only as a starting point. Intelligence was valued, but primarily as a means of heightening the psychological impact of his tests. What Stefan truly sought was a woman who could endure unimaginable suffering while maintaining perfect composure. A living doll who could smile serenely while dying inside. The first woman to undergo Stefan's bride test was Maria of Transylvania, daughter of a minor Hungarian noble, desperate to align his family with Moldavian power. Maria was 19, renowned for her beauty and education, and completely unprepared for what awaited her at Stefan's court. She arrived in the autumn of 1452, expecting the usual rounds of courtly entertainment, diplomatic negotiations, and gradual courtship that characterized most royal marriages. Instead, Stefan announced that Maria would need to prove her worthiness through a series of escalating challenges that would test every aspect of her character. The first test seemed almost playful, a requirement that she learn to embroider a complex tapestry depicting Stefan's family history while blindfolded. When she struggled with the impossible task, Stefan expressed disappointment in her lack of dedication to perfection. The second test required Maria to memorize and recite hundreds of lines of Latin poetry while standing motionless for hours at a time. Any mistake, any movement, any sign of fatigue would require her to start over from the beginning. Stefan would sit nearby, watching her struggle with the intensity of a cat, observing a trapped mouse. The third test introduced the element that would become Stefan's signature: deliberate starvation. Maria was informed that a truly noble woman should be able to survive on spiritual nourishment alone, requiring minimal earthly sustenance. Her daily food ration was reduced to a single piece of bread and a cup of water. When she began to show signs of weakness, Stefan praised her growing ethereal beauty, claiming that physical frailty revealed spiritual strength. Palace servants who witnessed Maria's decline described a transformation that was both pitiful and terrifying. The vibrant young woman who had arrived full of hope and dignity gradually became a hollow-eyed wraith who moved through the castle like a ghost. Her elaborate gowns hung loose on her shrinking frame. Her once lustrous hair became thin and brittle. Her skin took on the grayish pallor of someone slowly dying. But Stefan wasn't finished. The fourth test required Maria to maintain perfect emotional control while enduring increasingly cruel psychological torments. Stefan would describe in graphic detail the suffering of her family members, claiming they were being tortured because of her failures. He would show her forged letters supposedly from her parents, begging her to abandon the courtship and return home. He would bring in other women, healthier and more beautiful, and compare them favorably to Maria's deteriorating appearance. Through it all, Maria was expected to smile, to express gratitude for Stefan's attention, and to insist that no sacrifice was too great for the honor of potentially becoming his queen. The slightest sign of anger, sadness, or resentment would result in further reductions to her food rations and additional humiliations designed to break her spirit completely. Stefan documented Maria's decline with the meticulous attention of a natural philosopher studying a fascinating specimen. He kept detailed records of her weight loss, noting how many pounds she shed each week. He had court artists create portraits showing her transformation from healthy young woman to skeletal wraith. He even commissioned a series of sculptures depicting various stages of her deterioration, which he displayed in his private chambers like trophies. The psychological impact on Maria was devastating in ways that went far beyond simple hunger. Stefan's tests were designed to destroy her sense of self-worth, to convince her that her suffering was not only deserved, but evidence of her growing spiritual purity. He surrounded her with attendants who had been carefully trained to reinforce these messages, creating an environment where reality itself seemed to support Stefan's twisted worldview. Maria began to internalize Stefan's teachings, actually believing that her starvation was making her more worthy, more noble, more suited to rule beside him. She would thank him for reducing her meals, praise him for showing her the path to true refinement, and expressed concern that she might not be suffering enough to prove her devotion. The young woman who had once been confident and independent had been systematically reprogrammed to find meaning only in her own degradation. But Stefan's cruelest innovation was yet to come. As Maria approached the point of physical collapse, he introduced what he called the test of ultimate sacrifice. She would be required to choose between her own survival and her worthiness to become queen. Stefan presented her with two options. She could eat a full meal and abandon her quest to marry him, or she could continue fasting until their wedding day, accepting that she might die in the process. Maria, her mind clouded by months of starvation and psychological manipulation, chose to continue the fast. She saw this as the ultimate proof of her love and dedication, not recognizing it as the final stage of a carefully orchestrated campaign to destroy her humanity. Stefan smiled when she made this choice, not with affection or admiration, but with the satisfaction of a craftsman whose masterpiece was nearing completion. The other nobles at Stefan's court watched these proceedings with a mixture of horror and fascination. Some were genuinely appalled by the king's treatment of Maria, but none dared to intervene. Stefan's previous test had made it clear that opposition to his methods would result in becoming the subject of even worse experiments. Others found themselves drawn into the twisted logic of Stefan's worldview, convincing themselves that these extreme measures were necessary to identify a queen capable of sharing the burdens of absolute power. As winter deepened and Maria's condition deteriorated further, whispers began circulating throughout the kingdom about the bride test taking place within the castle walls. Some subjects expressed outrage at their king's cruelty, while others argued that a queen needed to be strong enough to endure any hardship. The debate revealed how effectively Stefan's reign of terror had corrupted the moral compass of his entire realm. But Maria's story was far from over, and Stefan's appetite for human experimentation was far from satisfied. Meanwhile, word of Stefan's bride test began spreading beyond Moldavia's borders, reaching the courts of neighboring kingdoms through the whispered reports of merchants, diplomats, and fleeing refugees. The stories grew more horrific with each retelling. Tales of a mad king who starved beautiful women for sport, who treated potential queens like laboratory animals, who had turned marriage into a form of ritualized murder. These accounts reached the ears of Isabella of Byzantium, a noblewoman whose family had lost everything when Constantinople fell to the Ottomans. Isabella was 25, older than most unmarried women of her station, but her intelligence and political connections made her valuable to families seeking advantageous alliances. When her guardian, a desperate Hungarian count drowning in debt, proposed that she journey to Moldavia to attempt Stefan's bride test, Isabella initially laughed at the absurdity. But Isabella's laughter died when she learned the true state of her guardian's finances. His estates had been seized by creditors, his remaining servants sold to pay debts, and his family faced complete ruin. Isabella's marriage to Stefan represented the only hope of restoring their fortunes. The dowry Stefan offered for a successful bride would be enough to save not just her guardian's household, but dozens of families dependent on his patronage. Unlike Maria, Isabella arrived at Stefan's court with full knowledge of what awaited her. She had spent weeks preparing herself mentally and physically for the ordeal ahead, studying accounts of previous candidates and developing strategies for survival. Isabella understood that Stefan's tests weren't really about proving worthiness. They were about satisfying his compulsion to witness human suffering in its most refined and prolonged forms. Stefan greeted Isabella's arrival with obvious delight. Here was a challenger who came to him not as an innocent lamb, but as a worthy opponent who understood the rules of his twisted game. The king saw in Isabella's calculating gaze and composed demeanor the promise of a more sophisticated form of entertainment than Maria's gradual collapse had provided. The first test Stefan devised for Isabella revealed his growing expertise in psychological manipulation. Rather than beginning with physical deprivation, he started with intellectual humiliation. Isabella was required to solve increasingly complex mathematical problems, while court scholars deliberately provided her with incorrect information and flawed tools. When she inevitably made mistakes, Stefan would express profound disappointment in her mental capabilities. suggesting that perhaps she lacked the intelligence necessary to rule beside him. Isabella recognized this strategy immediately. Stefan was attempting to undermine her confidence in her own abilities, to make her doubt the very qualities that had sustained her through previous hardships. Instead of becoming defensive or apologetic, Isabella adopted a different approach. She began praising Stefan's wisdom in designing such challenging tests, expressing gratitude for the opportunity to demonstrate her dedication to self-improvement. This response clearly frustrated Stefan, who had expected Isabella to show signs of stress and self-doubt by this point in the process. Her apparent serenity and continued confidence suggested either remarkable inner strength or dangerous cunning. Either possibility intrigued him enough to escalate the testing process more rapidly than he had with previous candidates. The second test introduced physical discomfort designed to break down Isabella's composure over time. She was required to stand motionless in the castle's courtyard for hours each day, regardless of weather conditions, while reciting prayers in languages she was still learning. The slightest movement, the smallest mispronunciation, would reset the clock on her required standing time. Isabella endured freezing rain, scorching sun, and howling winds while maintaining perfect posture and clear pronunciation. But Stefan noticed something that disturbed him. Isabella seemed to enter a meditative state during these ordeals, almost as if she was drawing strength from the suffering rather than being weakened by it. Her ability to transcend physical discomfort through the mental discipline represented a form of resistance he hadn't encountered before. Determined to crack Isabella's apparent invulnerability, Stefan moved quickly to the third test: controlled starvation combined with psychological warfare. Isabella's daily food ration was reduced to the same meager portions that had slowly killed Maria, but Stefan added a new element of cruelty. Each day he would have elaborate feasts prepared and displayed before Isabella, describing in loving detail the taste and texture of foods she was forbidden to eat. The smell of roasted meats, fresh bread, and exotic spices would fill Isabella's chambers while she subsisted on stale crusts and murky water. Stefan would invite other courtiers to these mock feasts, encouraging them to comment loudly on the delicious flavors while Isabella sat nearby, her stomach cramping with hunger but her expression remaining serene. But Isabella had prepared for this psychological assault. She had trained herself to view hunger not as weakness, but as a form of spiritual purification practiced by religious mystics throughout history. When Stefan described the forbidden foods, Isabella would respond by discussing the superior nourishment provided by spiritual contemplation. When courtiers mocked her abstinence, she would thank them for helping her understand the difference between earthly and divine sustenance. Stefan's frustration with Isabella's responses began manifesting in increasingly erratic behavior. He would pace his chambers at night, muttering about ungrateful women who failed to appreciate the honor of his attention. He began consulting with physicians and philosophers, seeking new methods for breaking down human resistance to suffering. Most disturbingly, he started bringing Maria to witness Isabella's tests, using the previous candidate's deteriorated condition as both warning and inspiration. Maria had survived her ordeal barely, but at a cost that was evident to anyone who looked upon her. She moved like an elderly woman despite being only 20, her once beautiful face now bearing the permanent marks of prolonged starvation. Her hair had never fully grown back. Her teeth had become loose and discolored, and her hands shook constantly from nerve damage caused by malnutrition. Yet Stefan paraded Maria before Isabella as an example of successful completion of his bride test. Maria herself, her mind still warped by months of psychological manipulation, would praise Stefan's wisdom and encourage Isabella to embrace the purifying power of suffering. These encounters were perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect of Isabella's ordeal, forcing her to witness the ultimate consequences of Stefan's testing process while maintaining her own sanity and determination. As Isabella's body began showing the inevitable signs of starvation, the hollow cheeks, the prominent ribs, the dull eyes that marked all of Stefan's test subjects, the king introduced new elements designed to exploit her weakening physical condition. She was required to perform increasingly complex tasks while struggling with the mental fog and physical weakness that accompanied severe malnutrition. Isabella had to copy lengthy documents in perfect handwriting, while her hands trembled from hunger. She needed to solve mathematical problems while her brain struggled to function on minimal calories. She was expected to engage in sophisticated political discussions while fighting to remain conscious during conversations that could determine her fate. Stefan documented every aspect of Isabella's decline with the same obsessive attention he had shown with Maria. But Isabella's case presented unique challenges for his record-keeping. Unlike previous subjects who had shown clear patterns of psychological breakdown, Isabella maintained an almost supernatural level of mental discipline, even as her body wasted away. Court observers began whispering that Isabella might possess supernatural powers or divine protection. Some suggested she was a witch who had made bargains with dark forces to sustain herself through impossible ordeals. Others believed she was a saint whose suffering was elevating her to a higher spiritual plane. Stefan found these rumors deeply disturbing, not because he believed in supernatural explanations, but because they suggested his subjects saw Isabella as something more than a victim of his experiments. The king's response was to design even more elaborate and cruel tests, determined to find the breaking point that would reduce Isabella to the same broken state as his previous subjects. He began incorporating elements of physical torture into the testing process, justifying these escalations as necessary measures to evaluate Isabella's fitness for the extreme challenges of royal life. Isabella was forced to hold burning coals while reciting poetry, to stand on sharp stones while solving puzzles, to endure controlled applications of pain that left no permanent marks but created constant agony. Through it all, she maintained the same serene composure that had initially attracted Stefan's interest, and now drove him to the edge of madness. But Stefan's most diabolical innovation was yet to come. He realized that Isabella's strength came from her ability to find meaning in suffering, to transform pain into a form of spiritual achievement. His solution was to design tests that would force her to choose between her own survival and the welfare of others. Tests that would corrupt her moral foundation and destroy the philosophical framework that sustained her resistance. Stefan brought in prisoners from his dungeons, political dissidents and common criminals alike, and announced that Isabella's performance in her tests would determine their fates. If she failed to meet his standards on any given day, innocent people would be tortured or executed. If she showed signs of weakness or rebellion, families would be torn apart and children sold into slavery. This psychological warfare proved more effective than months of physical torment. Isabella found herself trapped between her desire to resist Stefan's cruelty and her inability to allow others to suffer for her defiance. She began pushing herself beyond even her remarkable limits, accepting ever more severe deprivations and humiliations to protect people she had never met, but whose lives now depended on her endurance. Stefan watched Isabella's internal struggle with the satisfaction of an artist perfecting his masterpiece. He had finally found the key to breaking her spirit, not through attacking her body or mind directly, but by weaponizing her own compassion against her. Every act of kindness she had ever performed, every moment of empathy she had ever felt, now became a tool for her own destruction. As winter gave way to spring, Isabella's condition reached the same critical point that had nearly killed Maria. But unlike his previous subject, Isabella retained enough mental clarity to understand exactly what Stefan was doing to her. She recognized his tests for what they truly were, not examinations of worthiness, but elaborate rituals of sadistic gratification disguised as royal prerogative. This recognition presented Isabella with a terrible choice. She could continue playing Stefan's game, slowly dying while he documented her decline for his twisted amusement. Or she could find a way to turn his own methods against him, using the very cruelty he inflicted as a weapon in her fight for survival. The decision she made would determine not only her own fate, but the future of every woman who might face Stefan's bride test in the years to come. The plan Isabella devised was born from desperation and fueled by months of careful observation. She had watched Stefan's patterns, studied his reactions, and identified the one weakness in his seemingly impenetrable armor of cruelty: his need for witnesses to validate his twisted experiments. Stefan's sadism wasn't complete unless others acknowledged his power over life and death. He required an audience for his brutality, craved recognition for his elaborate tortures disguised as tests of character. Isabella began implementing her strategy during what Stefan announced would be her final test before their wedding ceremony. She was to survive 7 days and nights without any food or water, while remaining conscious and articulate enough to recite wedding vows at the ceremony's conclusion. Stefan had never pushed any subject to this extreme. It was almost certainly a death sentence disguised as a matrimonial requirement. But Isabella didn't resist this ultimate challenge. Instead, she embraced it with an enthusiasm that immediately unsettled Stefan. She thanked him profusely for providing such a magnificent opportunity to prove her devotion. She praised his wisdom in designing a test that would elevate her to the spiritual heights necessary for queenship. Most disturbingly, she began describing her approaching death not as a tragedy, but as a transcendent achievement that would make her the most worthy bride in European history. Stefan had expected Isabella to finally break under this impossible demand. He had prepared elaborate documentation equipment to record her psychological collapse, her desperate pleas for mercy, her inevitable surrender to the reality of her mortality. Instead, he found himself watching a woman who seemed genuinely excited about the prospect of dying for his entertainment. Isabella's apparent eagerness to embrace death created an unexpected problem for Stefan. His pleasure came from witnessing reluctant suffering, from forcing victims to endure horrors they desperately wanted to escape. A subject who welcomed her own destruction robbed him of the psychological satisfaction that motivated his experiments. Stefan found himself in the unprecedented position of trying to convince a test subject to value her own life. On the second day without food or water, as Isabella's body began shutting down from dehydration, she started speaking to the assembled court about the profound honor Stefan was bestowing upon her. She described her approaching death as a wedding gift more precious than any jewels or gold. She claimed that dying during Stefan's bride test would make her immortal in ways that surviving could never achieve. The courtiers who witnessed these declarations were deeply disturbed by Isabella's apparent madness. Some whispered that starvation had finally broken her mind completely. Others suggested that she had achieved a state of religious ecstasy that allowed her to transcend earthly concerns. But a few perceptive observers began to suspect that Isabella's enthusiasm might be calculated rather than genuine. Stefan himself was becoming increasingly agitated by Isabella's responses. He had spent months documenting her physical deterioration, anticipating the moment when she would finally beg for mercy, or at least show appropriate fear of death. Instead, she seemed to grow more serene and grateful with each passing hour of her final ordeal. By the third day, Isabella was barely conscious, her body consuming itself to maintain basic functions. Her speech had become slurred and intermittent, but when she did speak, it was to express gratitude for Stefan's extraordinary generosity in allowing her to die in such a meaningful way. She spoke of joining the ranks of legendary martyrs whose suffering had elevated them beyond ordinary humanity. Stefan found himself pacing his chambers frantically, consulting with physicians about methods for keeping Isabella alive against her apparent wishes. The irony was profound. The man who had spent years perfecting techniques for inflicting suffering was now desperately seeking ways to prevent the death he had orchestrated. His need to maintain control over the testing process was being undermined by a subject who refused to play the role of unwilling victim. The turning point came on the fourth day when Isabella, speaking in barely audible whispers, began describing visions she claimed to be experiencing. She spoke of angels who were praising Stefan's wisdom in creating such a perfect test of spiritual worthiness. She described divine voices that were thanking him for his role in facilitating her transformation from earthly woman to celestial being. But then Isabella's visions took a disturbing turn. She began reporting that the divine voices were criticizing other aspects of Stefan's rule. The angels, she claimed, were expressing disappointment in his treatment of common subjects who hadn't volunteered for testing as she had. The celestial beings were questioning why Stefan's experiments focused only on women when true wisdom required testing men as well. Stefan initially dismissed these reports as the delirious ramblings of a dying mind. But Isabella's criticisms were delivered with such specific detail and apparent divine authority that they began affecting the other courtiers. Some started whispering that perhaps God was indeed speaking through the starving woman, using her approaching martyrdom as an opportunity to communicate his displeasure with their king. Isabella's apparent divine communications became increasingly specific and politically dangerous. She reported that the angels were naming particular nobles who had enabled Stefan's cruelties, describing their eternal punishments in graphic detail. She spoke of heavenly displeasure with the kingdom's financial policies, its treatment of peasants, its neglect of Christian duties in favor of experimental sadism. The psychological impact on Stefan's court was devastating. Nobles who had spent years enabling the king's experiments suddenly found themselves named as divine targets for punishment. Courtiers who had participated in the elaborate rituals of testing began questioning whether they were complicit in activities that God himself condemned. The entire power structure that supported Stefan's reign began showing signs of instability. Stefan realized that Isabella had somehow turned his own methods against him. By accepting death so enthusiastically, she had transformed herself from victim into prophet. By claiming divine inspiration for her criticisms, she had found a way to attack his authority that he couldn't simply dismiss or punish. After all, he could hardly torture a woman who was already dying for his entertainment without appearing to oppose God's will directly. But Isabella's most devastating stroke was yet to come. On the 5th day, as she hovered near death, she announced that her divine visions had revealed Stefan's true destiny. The angels, she claimed, had shown her that Stefan himself was meant to undergo the ultimate test of worthiness. Not as a king examining subjects, but as a soul preparing for divine judgment. Isabella described in detail how Stefan would need to experience the same deprivations he had inflicted on others before he could achieve the spiritual purification necessary for true leadership. She spoke of divine requirements that the king submit himself to tests of hunger, thirst, pain, and humiliation administered by subjects he had previously tormented. Only through such experiences, she claimed, could Stefan understand the true nature of the worthiness he had been evaluating in others. The court listened to these pronouncements with growing fascination and horror. Isabella's words carried the authority of approaching martyrdom, the weight of someone who had endured Stefan's worst torments, and emerged spiritually victorious. Her predictions began to seem less like the ravings of a dying woman, and more like prophetic revelations that demanded serious consideration. Stefan found himself trapped by the very dynamics he had created. He had built his authority on the principle that extreme suffering revealed ultimate truth about human character. Now, Isabella was using that same principle to suggest that his own character remained untested and therefore suspect. He couldn't reject her logic without undermining the philosophical foundation of his entire reign. The king's response revealed the depth of his psychological instability. Instead of ending Isabella's test or acknowledging the dangerous precedent her resistance had established, Stefan announced that he would indeed submit himself to examination, but only after Isabella's death proved the validity of her divine visions. He was essentially promising to torture himself if Isabella succeeded in dying for his entertainment. This bizarre commitment created a new form of psychological torture for Stefan himself. Every hour that Isabella survived brought him closer to the self-imposed ordeal he had promised to undergo. Every moment of her continued existence reminded him that his own worthiness remained unproven by his own standards. He began experiencing the same anticipatory dread that he had inflicted on countless subjects over the years. Isabella, barely clinging to consciousness, seemed to understand the psychological reversal she had achieved. When Stefan visited her on the 6th day, she smiled with genuine warmth for the first time since arriving at his court. She thanked him not for the honor of dying in his service, but for the wisdom he had shown in recognizing his own need for testing. The final day of Isabella's ordeal coincided with what was supposed to be their wedding ceremony. Stefan had planned this timing as the ultimate demonstration of his power. A bride who would either die during her vows or speak them with her final breath. Instead, he found himself conducting a ceremony that felt more like a funeral for his own authority. Isabella managed to remain conscious long enough to speak her wedding vows, but the words she chose were not the traditional promises of obedience and devotion. Instead, she spoke of the sacred trust between ruler and subject, the divine responsibility of power, and the eternal consequences of failing to protect those who depended on royal mercy. Her vows sounded less like a bride's promises and more like a dying prophet's final warnings. The assembled court witnessed something unprecedented in Stefan's reign. A test subject who had not only survived his cruelest experiment, but had somehow emerged victorious from it. Isabella's survival, achieved through acceptance rather than resistance, had revealed the fundamental emptiness of Stefan's philosophy. She had proven that his tests measured nothing more than his own capacity for inflicting suffering. But Isabella's triumph came at a cost that would haunt both her and Stefan for whatever time remained to them. She had saved her life by sacrificing her body to the point where normal existence would never again be possible. The woman who had outmaneuvered the cruelest king in Europe was now a living skeleton, whose every breath was a struggle against approaching death. Stefan, meanwhile, faced the psychological consequences of being defeated by his own methods. The subjects who had once feared his tests now whispered about the king, who had been outsmarted by a starving woman. The nobles who had enabled his experiments began questioning whether their loyalty had been misplaced. The entire structure of fear and fascination that had sustained his reign was crumbling under the weight of Isabella's unexpected victory. As the wedding feast began, a grotesque celebration where the bride could consume nothing, and the groom had lost his appetite for cruelty, both Stefan and Isabella understood that they had fundamentally changed each other. She had survived his worst torments by transforming them into sources of spiritual strength. He had been broken by watching his carefully crafted torture become someone else's path to transcendence. The marriage that followed would be unlike any in European history. A union between a woman who had conquered death through acceptance and a man who had lost his purpose through the very success of his cruelest experiment. But the true test of their twisted relationship was only beginning, and the kingdom that had enabled Stefan's bride test was about to discover the consequences of allowing such systematic cruelty to flourish unchallenged. In the months that followed their nightmarish wedding, the true horror of Stefan's bride test began to reveal itself in ways no one had anticipated. Isabella survived, but survival in her condition was perhaps crueler than death would have been. Her body, pushed beyond all reasonable limits of human endurance, never recovered from the systematic starvation she had endured. She moved through the castle corridors like a living ghost, her wedding gown still hanging loose on a frame that seemed to shrink further with each passing day. The psychological aftermath proved even more devastating than the physical damage. Isabella had won her battle of wills with Stefan, but victory had required her to embrace suffering so completely that she could no longer distinguish between pain and purpose. She would spend hours staring out palace windows, speaking to visitors about the transcendent beauty of hunger, the spiritual clarity that came from approaching death. Court physicians whispered that her mind had been permanently altered by prolonged malnutrition, that the woman who had outsmarted the cruelest king in Europe was now trapped in a reality where suffering had become her only source of meaning. Stefan himself faced an even more complex psychological torment. His promise to submit himself to the same tests he had inflicted on others haunted every moment of his waking life. The courtiers who had once enabled his experiments now watched him with expectant eyes, waiting to see if their king would honor his commitment to divine testing. Some whispered that his failure to begin his own ordeal proved he was a coward who could dish out suffering but couldn't endure it himself. Others suggested that perhaps God was waiting for Stefan to demonstrate his worthiness through voluntary submission to the same torments he had perfected. The king began experiencing what could only be described as anticipatory terror. Every meal became a reminder of the hunger he had promised to endure. Every comfortable moment in his royal chambers brought thoughts of the deprivations that awaited him. He started losing weight not from deliberate fasting, but from the stress of knowing that his own testing was inevitable. His sleep became fitful, filled with dreams where he was the subject rather than the administrator of his elaborate bride tests. But Stefan's psychological deterioration manifested in ways that revealed the true depths of his disturbed character. Rather than beginning his promised self-testing, he began designing even more elaborate experiments for other subjects. It was as if he believed that inflicting sufficient suffering on others might somehow fulfill his commitment to experience testing himself. He brought in new candidates for various forms of examination: merchants accused of dishonesty, nobles suspected of disloyalty, clergy who had questioned his methods. The kingdom that had once tolerated Stefan's excesses as the eccentricities of absolute power now began to recognize them as symptoms of dangerous madness. Isabella's resistance had revealed the fundamental emptiness of Stefan's philosophy, but it had also demonstrated that his cruelty had no limits, no ultimate purpose beyond the satisfaction of his own twisted psychology. The subjects who had once whispered about his bride test now spoke openly about the need for intervention. Isabella, despite her weakened condition, became an unlikely focal point for growing resistance to Stefan's rule. Her survival of the ultimate bride test had given her a moral authority that even Stefan couldn't entirely dismiss. When she spoke about the kingdom's need for healing, for an end to the systematic cruelty that had become normalized under Stefan's reign, people listened with the reverence typically reserved for religious figures. The irony was profound. The woman Stefan had tried to destroy through his most elaborate test had become the voice of opposition to everything his reign represented. Her physical frailty was offset by a spiritual strength that seemed to grow more powerful as her body continued to waste away. She began holding audiences with subjects who had suffered under Stefan's various testing programs, offering comfort to the broken families and damaged survivors his experiments had left behind. Stefan's response to Isabella's growing influence revealed the paranoid delusions that had always lurked beneath his facade of methodical cruelty. He became convinced that his wife was orchestrating a conspiracy against him, using her apparent divine favor to turn his subjects against their rightful king. He began having her watched constantly, searching for evidence of treasonous communications with foreign powers or domestic enemies. But Isabella's rebellion, if it could be called that, was far more subtle and devastating than anything Stefan's paranoid imagination could conceive. She simply continued living according to the principles she had used to survive his bride test, finding meaning in suffering, transforming pain into spiritual achievement, treating every hardship as an opportunity for transcendence. This approach made her virtually immune to Stefan's traditional methods of control and punishment. The final confrontation between Stefan and Isabella came not through dramatic conflict, but through a quiet conversation that revealed the complete moral bankruptcy of everything Stefan had built. Isabella, now so weakened that she could barely stand without support, asked Stefan a simple question that shattered the last remnants of his psychological defenses. "When will you begin your own test of worthiness?" Stefan's response was to fly into a rage that revealed the frightened child beneath his elaborate facade of controlled cruelty. He screamed about ungrateful subjects who failed to appreciate his wisdom, about divine tests that were too complex for simple minds to understand, about the burden of absolute power that required absolute methods. But his fury couldn't disguise the truth that Isabella had exposed. He was a coward who could inflict suffering but couldn't endure it, a king who demanded worthiness from others while remaining untested himself. The kingdom's patience with Stefan's madness finally reached its breaking point when news arrived that neighboring rulers were forming alliances specifically to address the Moldavian problem. Word of the bride test had spread throughout Europe, creating diplomatic isolation that threatened the realm's very survival. Stefan's systematic cruelty had become not just morally reprehensible, but politically catastrophic for everyone under his rule. The end came swiftly once the great nobles finally found the courage to act. Stefan was deposed not through dramatic battlefield confrontation, but through the quiet withdrawal of support from courtiers who had grown tired of enabling his experiments. He was found dead in his chambers, apparently having taken poison, rather than face the prospect of being subjected to the same tests he had inflicted on countless others. Isabella survived her husband by only a few months, her body finally succumbing to the damage inflicted during those horrific months of systematic starvation. But her death was mourned throughout the kingdom as the passing of a saint who had sacrificed herself to expose and end Stefan's reign of terror. The woman who had endured the most brutal bride test in history was remembered not as a victim, but as a victor who had used her tormentor's own methods to destroy him. The bride test died with Stefan, but its legacy lingered in the traumatized kingdom he left behind. The survivors of his various experiments struggled to rebuild their lives, their bodies and minds permanently scarred by experiences that had pushed human endurance beyond all reasonable limits. The nobles who had enabled his cruelty faced their own reckonings, forced to confront their complicity in systematic torture disguised as royal prerogative. Perhaps most tragically, the story of Stefan's bride test revealed how easily societies can normalize the most extreme forms of cruelty when they're presented as tests of character or demonstrations of worthiness. The same courtiers who had watched Isabella waste away during her ordeal had convinced themselves they were witnessing spiritual purification rather than methodical torture. The same subjects who had enabled Stefan's experiments had told themselves they were serving a king who demanded the highest standards rather than a madman who enjoyed inflicting suffering. The tale of starved brides and twisted tests serves as a reminder that the most dangerous monsters in history are often those who dress their cruelty in the language of nobility, who transform torture into ritual, who convince others that their victims deserve the suffering inflicted upon them. Stefan's bride test was monstrous not just because of the physical damage it inflicted, but because of how it corrupted everyone who witnessed it, turning observers into enablers and suffering into entertainment. Today, Stefan's castle stands in ruins, his testing chambers long since crumbled into dust. But the questions his reign raised about power, cruelty, and complicity remain as relevant as ever. In our own time, when systematic abuse is often disguised as tradition, when suffering is rationalized as character building, when the vulnerable are sacrificed to prove points about strength and worthiness, the ghost of Stefan's bride test whispers its warning across the centuries. The young women who endured those horrific ordeals, who were starved and broken in the name of royal matrimony, deserve to be remembered not as curiosities from a darker age, but as human beings whose suffering revealed both the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human resilience. Their stories remind us that behind every historical account of systematic abuse lie individual lives destroyed by those who confused power with wisdom, cruelty with strength, and suffering with virtue. In the end, Stefan's bride test failed, not because it was too cruel, but because it revealed the emptiness at the heart of all systematic oppression. Isabella's victory came not from defeating her tormentor through force, but from exposing the fundamental weakness that drove his need to inflict suffering on others. Her legacy lives on as proof that even in the darkest circumstances, even when facing the most elaborate forms of cruelty, the human spirit can find ways to transform suffering into strength, victimhood into victory, and despair into hope. The bride who was starved to prove her worthiness ultimately proved something far more important. That true strength lies not in the ability to inflict suffering, but in the courage to endure it without losing one's humanity. And that the greatest test of character is not how much pain we can cause others, but how much meaning we can find in our own struggles against those who would reduce us to objects of their twisted entertainment.